This is a tape measure. And on this tape measure, you'll see many different numbers and marks. In order to learn how to read this, we're going to start with some simple concepts and then move our way up to the more complex. Now, when you look at the tape measure, you're gonna see a bunch of marks all over the thing. And they range in size from these lines that are right next to these big numbers, and then in between the big numbers, there are little tiny marks. Let's start by looking at the biggest lines. This big line next to the 3, this big line next to the 4, that big line next to the 5, and on. Those mark inches. Between this line and this line is 1 inch. Between this line and this line is 1 inch. So let's just try and measure something and see what happens. I'm gonna measure how long this level is. To do that, I'm gonna take the hook end of my tape and hook it on one end and then slide the tape down to the other end. Now you can see that, lucky me, this level measures exactly 24 inches. So this object right here is an example of something that measures exactly to one of those big lines. So if someone were to ask me to measure this, I could take out my tape measure, hook it on there, measure it, and I could tell them it's 24 inches. That means it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 big marks from the end of the tape. Okay, now I'm looking for something a little bit more complex. Let's try this. So I found something that does not line up on one of those big lines, but it lines up on the medium line right there. See that? So this measures to that line halfway between 5 and 6. So I could say it's halfway or right in the middle. So if someone were to ask me the distance between here and here, I would tell them it's 5.5 inches. Because remember, the distance between one big mark and another big mark is 1 inch. But if I go in the middle of that, it's going to be halfway between the 5 and the 6. So that's why I say 5.5. Now, if that's not quite making sense, let's break it down a little bit more simply. I drew on this piece of paper a replica of the tape measure, but just the big marks. So you can see how this first line lines up with the 1, and that one lines up with the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these are whole numbers. But remember, this did not line up with one of the whole numbers. It fell on the half mark, or that medium-sized mark there. So that means I can't just look at the tape measure in its most simple form. Now I have to go to the next level and look at more marks than just the big ones. I have to start looking at these smaller marks, specifically this one right here. So to step up to the next level of complexity of reading the tape measure, I'm going to reveal the half-inch marks here. See, now if I slide my tape measure up, not only do I still see the big marks there, but I have the ones right in the middle. Those represent half inch. So this is halfway between this big one and that big one. So that's why it's 1/2. 1/2 and then 2 halves makes a whole. So that's why when I measure this orange piece of plastic here, it's 5.5 inches because it ends on that mark right there. To put that concept on a larger scale, let's say this is one whole piece of wood, and each one of these smaller pieces represents 1/2. So I have to put these two pieces together to match, to match this whole piece. Now they're the same. That's 1/2. That's another half. And just like on the tape measure, let's say this is one of those big lines, like this is the 5, and this is a big line, that's a 6, but in the middle, that's our half mark. Okay, now let's take it to the next level. This little chunk of wood here, it measures to not one of the big lines and not one of the medium lines, but then the next smallest line, which is called a quarter. So that means on my complexity scale here, I'm gonna have to level up and go to here. This was the big line, that's the whole number. This is the half, now this is the quarter. So you can see here between one big mark and another big mark, there's 1, 2, 3, and then the fourth is a whole. If we come back over to the wood blocks, remember, this was a whole, these were half, and these are quarters. 1, 2, 3, 4 makes a whole. And see how this line lines up with that one in the middle? Now we're just breaking this down even more, each time getting a little bit more complex. So let's take a look at this again. When I hook my tape on there, the end of it lines up on that mark right there, and that's one of the quarter marks. See, the end of the tape is the big mark. Where the 1 is, that's another big mark. In the middle is a half, that's this one right here. But then over here is the third quarter mark. That's 1 quarter, that's 2 quarters, and that's 3 quarters. So it's 1, 2, 3. So if someone were to ask me to measure this, I would tell them that it's 3/4 inches, or 3/4 of an inch. See, the 1 is there and it's shorter than 1. 3/4 of an inch. So far we've learned how to measure things that line up with the big marks on the tape measure, the medium-sized marks between the big marks, that's these ones right here. We just learned about the quarter marks, which is the marks between the big and the medium. And again, you can see how everything is lining up. So there's still the big marks on each one of these, and there's still the half marks on each one of these, but I'm just stacking these on top of each other. So eventually my piece of paper is gonna look just like the tape, but I'm working there in stages to show you guys what each one of those lines means. So on my search for something a little bit more complicated, I found another thing that lines up with the quarter marks. So I'm gonna hook my tape on there, measure over to there, and see which one of those lines it lines up with. It's not the big one, it's not the middle one, it's one of the quarters. And it's the third quarter line from 5. The distance between the end here and here is 5 and 1, 2, 3/4 of an inch. So if I were to need to know the distance between here and here, I could say it's 5 3/4. So we're gonna step up to the next level here, but you'll notice that each time I'm stepping up, the numbers are doubling. From 2 to 4, that's doubling. So that means from here to here, we're gonna double again, and we're gonna go from 4ths to 8ths. So as I slide this up, now, see all those marks? Those are 8ths. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the 8th is the big line. And I found something here, this little block of foam sandpaper. So you guys tell me, what is the measurement of this? You see that? It's lining up with that next level mark. It's not the smallest mark on the tape measure, but it's the second from the smallest. Those are the 8ths. So this foam piece of sandpaper measures 3 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. It's not quite to the 4. It's just short of the 4, and it lands on that mark right there. That's 7/8. So this foam block is 3 7/8 long. So now we're starting to make sense of all these little lines on this tape measure. Big ones are the whole numbers. Medium ones are half. When we size down from the half, we go to a quarter. Then we size down from that, we get to an 1/8. And then the shortest line on there, that is a 1/16. So again, let's look at our wood blocks here. Remember, that was a whole. Those two are a half. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. That's quarters. There's 8 pieces here to represent an 1/8. And if I stick all of those onto there, you can see how it's the same. That's one whole, but it's chopped up into 8 pieces. And that foam block that I measured was just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Remember, it wasn't all the way to the 4. It was 3 inches from the end, and then I had to add on 7/8. 3 and 7 of the 8s. And then the smallest marks on the tape are 16ths. And I found one thing that is a 16th. This can of paint here, if I measure it from the cap to the end, you might be able to see it lines up on one of the smallest marks on the tape measure. So with that said, let's reveal our final level on my piece of paper here, and that is the 16ths. So if I were to overlap each one of these on top of each other, it would represent what you see on the tape measure. The end of the can is lining up with one of those tiny marks. So now let's break it down. That middle mark between 9 and 10, that's 9.5. But we are just 1 mark short there of half. We're 1/16 short of a half. So if we think about this mathematically, remember these are 8 pieces here, and if I were to cut those 8s into half, I would get 16ths, like you see here. There's some 16ths, there's some more 16ths, there's all my 16ths. So remember, this is a whole, this line marks halfway, and I was 1/16 short of half. So let's see how many that is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 8th 16th would get me to halfway, but I was 1 short on my tape measure. So I was on this one. That's the 7th one. So that means the can measures 9 and 7/16. 9 and 7/16. I was 1 tiny mark short of halfway between 9 and 10. So to recap what we've learned so far, sometimes when you measure things, they line up with the biggest marks on the tape measure. Like this level, for example. It measures exactly 24 inches. Other times when you measure things, they might line up with the mark that's halfway between the big marks. Like this. This was 5.5. Sometimes things measure on the quarter line. This was 5 3/4. The foam block measured to 3 7/8, and the paint can measured to 9 7/16. So we've had examples of objects that measure to each one of those lines. And that's what I do when I'm measuring something. I pull out the tape, I go to the end of it, and I immediately look at which type of mark does this measure to. Does it measure to one of the smallest lines? Does it measure to one of the 8s? Does it measure to one of the quarters? Once I have identified that, then I look at the next biggest line and I say, okay, I'm right here. Now I'm going to think in 16ths because that's where this one lines up to. And then I'm going to think, okay, which 16th does it land at? How many of these little blocks am I going to have to go from the next biggest line to where the end of my object measures? And that's if it lands on the 16ths. And then it just goes on down the line. Does it land on a half mark? Does it land on a quarter? Does it land on an 1/8? You just identify which one of those lines it lands on, and then you go, okay, I'm dealing with 8s. Let's figure out how many 8s. And remember, the best way to learn is through experience. I've taught you all of the basic concepts and you've seen me show examples of each one of these things, but the way you're really going to learn this for yourself is through firsthand personal experience of measuring things. And through experience, you will be able to quickly identify, okay, I am dealing on this type of marking, or I'm dealing on this type of marking, or you'll just know as soon as you look at the tape measure whether you're going to be identifying in 16ths or 8ths or quarters or halves. And you will also learn the most simplified way to say measurements. See how I've written these numbers? This is 1 on the half line. I've written a 1 and a 3 on the quarter line. I've written a 1, 3, 5, and 7 on the 8th. And I've written 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, and 15 on the 16th. That's because those are the ways of identifying those lines on each one of those. For example, this one right here represents 1/2. Remember, 2/2 is just the same as a whole one here. So when something measures to one of the 1/2 inch lines here, I'm going to identify it as 1/2 because I could say it's 2 quarters. That's the same thing, but it's much more simple to say 1/2 instead of 2 quarters. You want to simplify things as much as possible. So 1/2 is the same as 2 quarters, and 1/2 is the same as 1, 2, 3, 4 eighths. See that? Same. And 1/2 is the same as 8/16. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the same. So when I'm measuring this orange piece of plastic, I could say it's 5 and 8/16 because it is 8 of those little marks. If I count out each of those little marks to get to the edge of my orange piece of plastic here, it's 8 of those little marks, but it's much more simple to just say 5 and 1/2. So when you're measuring things, just go with the simplest way to measure, to say them, to think about them. Go with as simple as you can. So that's the reason why I wrote these numbers the way that I did, because 1/2 is the same as 2 quarters, and it's the same as 4 eighths, and it's the same as 8/16. So now let's think about it the opposite way. See how I wrote 13 and 15 here? I didn't write 14 because there is a 14th mark here, but I wouldn't identify. If something measured to that 14th mark on this 16th scale, I wouldn't say 14/16. I would simplify it and I would say 7/8 because it's the same thing, but it's more simple to measure to the eighths. I don't have to measure to the smallest line because it measures to the eighth. So any of those lines on there that I didn't mark with a number, that's because there's a more simple way to say it if you go down the scale. So that is what this piece of paper means. That's what all of those numbers represent. And I'll put a still shot right here so that if you want to take a screenshot or study that and just spend some time to try and understand it if you need to. But that is what all those marks on your tape measure represent. So now, hopefully, I have given you a complete understanding of how to take a tape measure, hook it on one end, measure to the other end, and identify its length. But Diego, there's more on the tape measure than just all the little marks and the big numbers. What's the deal with this 1F right here? And what's the deal with all these little red numbers? And what's the deal with the red square around the 16? Okay, let's get into all of that. Let's talk about the first more complex marking that you'll see on the tape, and that is this 1F. That is at 12 inches. That's because, as many of you know, 12 inches is 1 foot. So when you use a ruler in school, it's 1 foot, 12 inches long. So from there to there is 12 inches or 1 foot. So on the 12, you'll see 1 foot. On the 24, you'll see 2 foot. On the 36, you'll see 3 foot. So hopefully that makes sense of the 1F, 2F, 3F, 4F, and on down the line that you'll see. The F represents a foot or 12-inch increments on your tape. Now, back to the red square. The first red square you're gonna see is on 16, and you'll see it on the next 16, which is 32. So at 16 inches, there's a red square. 32 inches, there's a red square. And then back to 48, there's another red square. And those red squares, or 16-inch increments, have to do with framing of buildings. So in the garage that I am in right now, behind all this stuff that I put on the walls, I covered up studs or 2x4s that are fastened from a bottom plate along the floor to a top plate along the top. And when people frame out a wall, their layout is either 16 inches or 24 inches on center. So if you were to put your tape measure on the middle of one of those wood studs and measure over to the next middle of the next stud, you would either find those studs to be on 16 inches apart from each other or 24 inches apart from each other. Now these studs inside the garage happen to be 16-inch on center. So before I put all this stuff on the walls, I could run a tape measure along the wall and there would be a stud every 16 inches. I would start from a stud right here, and then there would be another stud right here at 16, and then there would be another stud at 32, and then there would be another stud at 48. Now the reason people use either 24 inches on center or 16 on center is because both of those end up landing on 48. See, if I go 24 inches from the end of my tape, and then I go another 24 inches, I'm gonna land on 48. See, there's a 4F there. And if I go 16 inches from the end, and then another 16 gets me to 32, and then another 16 gets me to 48. That's why underneath the 4F, there's also a red square around the 48. 48 is a multiple of 24 and 16. And in construction, 48 inches and 96 inches. 96 inches is 8 feet. See that? 96 inches, 8F. Those are very important numbers because sheets of drywall like this, or sheets like I used out there, that T111 siding that I used on the skirting on the outside of the cabin, that sheet of plywood behind that shelf, that's 48 inches wide. That sheet of OSB is actually turned sideways and it's 8 feet from there to there, but it's 4 feet from there to there. So sheets of construction material often come, or almost exclusively, there's some that are a little bit longer, but for the most part, it's 4 feet wide by 8 feet tall or long. And when people frame or build their buildings, they use that layout 4 feet, and 8 feet, so that the sheets that they buy will lay flat on the wall, and then they're able to fasten or put screws in. Oh, here's another example right here. Perfect example. These rafters on the ceiling here, see how those are still exposed? You can still see them. Those are also behind these sheets of drywall, and you can see how I put the screws in there, and how I put screws in there, and then along the middle here. And I laid out all this drywall on the ceiling according to the space between the rafters. So if I measure 24, these are 24 on center. So that's why you only see screws on the ends of the sheet and then one down the middle, because the sheet is 4 feet wide and in the middle is 2 feet. But the walls inside the entry room of the cabin, they're all covered up now with drywall mud and texture, so you can't see any of the screws. But when I was laying that out, those studs were 16 inches apart, and so I put screws every 16 inches. And when I was finishing that room and when I was doing the ceiling in the garage, I spent a lot of time before I did anything walking around with my tape measure and figuring out, okay, these studs are 16 inch apart, these are 24, and then I hopped on my ladder and I ran this tape as far as it could go to make sure that it was laid out accurately, because I didn't build this garage, so I needed to check before I did anything. Okay, this is all gonna line up the way I want it to. Okay, so I talked about the 1F, 2F. You know what all the Fs represent. Now you know what the red squares represent. Okay, the last thing is the little red numbers. And those start, once you get past 1 foot, you'll see right next to the 13, there's a 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, all the way up to 11. And then instead of 12, you land on 2 feet. That's so that you can identify, okay, I'm 1 foot and however many additional inches. So it just depends on how you want to identify something. So you could either say, let's say something measures 19 inches and you want to tell somebody, hey, that board's 19 inches. You could say 19 inches, or depending on what project you're working on and the terminology that you're using, instead of 19 inches, you could say it's 1 foot and 7 inches. That's the same thing. 19 inches is the same as 1 foot 7 inches. So that's what those red numbers represent. It's just another way of identifying. Just like I said, there's more simple ways to identify when you're talking about all the little marks. Some people like to identify using these numbers like 65, or instead of 65, they could say 5 foot 5 inches. One perfect example is when you're measuring the height of somebody. Now, if you were to measure me, or if I were to measure myself, and someone would ask me, Diego, how tall are you? Am I gonna say, I'm 71 inches tall? Or am I gonna say, I'm 5 foot 11? Depends on what you're talking about. Usually, when people are talking about their height, they say it in those terms. I'm 5 foot 11, or I'm 6 foot. They could say, I'm 72 inches, but that's just not something people do in America. They don't say I'm 72 inches tall. They say I'm 6 feet tall. Wow, I'm shorter than I thought. That sucks. And I have shoes and a hat on. I'm like 5'10". I usually tell everybody I'm 5'11". Whoops. Now you may have noticed I've had different tape measures here during my presentation. So some designs are a little bit different. Here's this tape right here. This one actually has 30 seconds. So these are 16ths up here, and then it gets so small in its markings that it's 30 seconds. But that's only for the first 12 inches, and then after that it has 16ths. So look, this right here next to the 16, it says stud on it right there, stud. So you can see how each tape is a little bit different. Their markings are a little bit different, but for the most part, they all have those same basic markings. So now hopefully you'd be able to understand any tape measure that you pick up, you would know how to read it. See, now these are all 16 foot in length. So they are a little bit shorter, a little bit more flimsy, easier to bend. Whereas this one is 25 feet. It can go a lot longer. Plus its ability to not snap. These little tapes would not do that at that length. It's over 9 feet. Oh, wow. That's pretty impressive. Holy crap. Okay, 12 feet is about where that, yeah, it's about 12 feet. It can support itself until it snaps. Let's see what this one can do. Oh, see. Yeah, this one's just about got like a little over 3 feet in it, and it snaps. So it just depends on what you're using your tape for. So in the process of editing this video that you're watching right now, I am learning something new. There's black diamonds on tape measures, and according to Google, the black diamonds appear every 19 3/16 inches on metal tape measures, and they are for spacing I-beam timbers. Several wood product manufacturers offer I-beam timbers as a substitute for solid lumber floor joists. I was looking at the tape measure and I saw a black diamond, and I was like, huh, never seen that before, never used it before, so that's what it's for. This video is pretty long, so I'm gonna stop it here, but I could keep going on about tape measures, but that's mostly having to do with use of tape measures, using them in the field, different ways to use them, tips and tricks. But I'm gonna keep this video having to do with just how to measure using a tape, how to read, that's what it is, how to read a tape measure. Back to the original conclusion of the video. So that's a wrap for this video. Thanks for checking it out. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how to read a tape measure. Tape measure? Tape measure. If this is the first video that you've seen on my channel, welcome. I have a bunch of videos of me finishing this entire garage that I've been in this whole time, installing the lights, installing the sheeting on the walls, on the ceiling. I got some workout videos. I've got my off-grid cabin right next door that I've been completely renovating or doing my best to renovate using a tape measure for a lot of it. So if you want to check that out, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks.